Welcome to The Maintenance Mindset, an audio-video podcast brought to you by the Multifamily Media Network. I'm your host, Paul Rhodes, and over the more than 3 decades in the apartment industry, I've had roles that include being on-site, providing services as a vendor, creating and delivering multiple education programs, and active association work. This podcast is centered on the often overlooked role that our on-site maintenance workers play. You know, the men and women that respond in the middle of the night to the toilet call, or the after hours, it's really hot in my apartment request, or my favorite, my ring fell down the drain, get over here now. In other words, the often unsung heroes who are responsible for asset preservation and resident satisfaction. Working in multifamily maintenance provides interesting, sometimes amusing, and often fascinating stories and viewpoints. My encouragement to you is this: whatever you do it with a maintenance mindset. Today on The Maintenance Mindset, we're going to be talking about a conversation. As a matter of fact, just a little bit of insight or behind the scenes. These shows I view internally as a conversation. Now, I recognize that you and I are not in the same place at the same time. I'm in my office, you're in your car or on a bus, or you're maybe in a vacant apartment listening to this while you get it ready. Maybe you're in your office and trying to avoid some work and you happen to decide to listen to me come up with something that I think would be educational. Whatever the situation is, the case in point is that right now, in this moment, it is a one-way lecture, if you would. But the insight is, I view this as a conversation because that's how it starts. About 2.5, 3 years ago, I listened to a very smart man answer the question, what is the best way to learn something from a book? And he went on to describe that the best way to learn is not from a book, but in a conversation with somebody else who's lived it and experienced it. A dialogue, a back and forth, to where both parties can be sure that the other person is having the same definition of what is being described in real time. And then this man went on to talk about a book you can still do that same thing with. Now, the man who did this is Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's a commentator, does a lot of YouTube videos, and he's a clinical psychologist, and he's taught at Harvard and very smart. And I enjoy listening to him talk because he makes me think. I can't say I agree with everything that he says and does, but that's kind of the point. You see, what he went on to describe about how the best way to learn from a book is that you read the book, close it, and then interact with the information that you just read. What he described is the best thing to do would be to take a book, and then you take that book and write notes. Summarize what it was that you just read. And that to me was fascinating, because if somebody else has written something and then I'm supposed to take that and internalize it to the point that I have to regurgitate it or write it, then, well, you see, my handwriting's awful and I'm decent at typing, but for me, typing, I spend more time figuring out what key I missed and hit than actually paying attention to what I'm doing. I'm a clipboard kind of person. I still, well, up until about 7-8 months ago, I traveled everywhere with a clipboard. That'll be a story for another show, I'm sure. But I came up with a different take on what Dr. Peterson had said. You see, in my mind, I want to have a conversation with the author. But of course, I can't do that. For instance, this book that I've quoted a couple of times that I continue to go back to a lot here lately is The Advice Trap by Michael Bungay Stanier. And, he lives up in Canada, it's my understanding, and grew up in Australia. Needless to say, wherever he is, it's not where I am. Like, ever. I would love to talk to him, but in person, I can't. And yet, he took the time to write down his thoughts, his experiences, and describe them in what he thinks is enough detail for me to understand at least his half of the conversation. I like reading, particularly nonfiction books, in this light. To that end, when I get a book, by the way, little caveat here, if anybody who's listening to this and you know my wife, please don't tell her this. I write in my books. I know. You see, writing in books, that's something that is verboten in her books and what she does. That's just the way she chooses. And I got to admit, up until listening and thinking through what Dr. Peterson had said, I was the same way. You never write in a book. Somebody else wrote it down. It needs to stay with what somebody else wrote. So what changed? Well, I'll tell you what changed. The fact that it's a conversation. I firmly believe when I'm reading a nonfiction book, something that I want to take something from, it is nonfiction. For instance, in here, he's talking about how giving advice is bad advice. And yet he does have this humorous line about he wrote a book on how bad it is to give advice, and he realizes the book is advice on why we shouldn't give advice and why we shouldn't. Well, one of the points that he made that really stuck with me was that it demotivates the receiver. In other words, the person on the other end does not get the opportunity to go through the joy of discovering for themselves. And he had this line about someone who is demotivated, and actually an entire team that at the time when I read it, it really struck a chord with me. And the statement was, teams made up of demotivated receivers and overwhelmed givers are less able to find and focus on the real challenge. In other words, when someone receives advice, they are demotivated to go through the process of discovery. And the givers are overwhelmed because the demotivated team no longer are going out through the process of discovery and figuring it out on their own. The givers are now overwhelmed because it seems like nobody will actually do something new. So that means the giver now is doing the job of the receiver. All in all, everybody is just in a bad situation. Well, that line, I had never thought of it that way before. And I wanted to be able to remember that later, maybe when it triggered in my brain. So I underlined it. And I draw little symbols and a little smiley face or happy note or just if it's something I really want to remember, then I fold it down. But I think the most unique thing is I begin to ask the author questions on the paper. Yes, I take a pen because I don't use pencils much anymore, but I take a pen and I actually will ask a question. For instance, I'm right now, the book I'm reading currently is Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I'm going through here, and it says his statement that he said is, you should be far more concerned with your current trajectory than with your current results. And that stuck me a second. It stuck with me of, wait a second. We are supposed to be developing goals for ourselves, SMART goals, specific, measurable, SMART, the acronym. We develop all of those. And yet here's this guy with over 15 million copies sold, and he's saying, be concerned with your trajectory than with your current results. And in the context, that's synonymous with goals. And I'm wondering, what? So I wrote the word why in the margin as kind of my half the conversation to him of, Mr. Clear, why should I be concerned with my current trajectory than with my current results? And a little bit later, he talked about the fact, and I love this line. I had to underline it, and I circled it because it's the answer to the question I asked of Mr. Clear. He answered my question in the book. Your outcomes are a lagging measure of your habits. And that concept made me pause and stop. I actually had to put down the book and begin to think through that. I'm sitting in a hotel room when I was traveling this past week, reading the book, and I'm staring out the window. It happened to be in Los Angeles this week. And that concept that your goals are a lagging indicator of the current work that you're producing. Just because of that one conversation I had with him of, why should I be more worried about the process than I am the outcome? And then he answered it, because the outcome is a lagging indicator of the work that you're doing today. Okay, how does that apply? Well, it applies because if I have an apartment that I need to get ready, if I have a make ready that needs to occur, if I have preventive maintenance that needs to happen on a property, then the fact that the preventive maintenance got completed, that's done at the end. As a matter of fact, if I complete it and then I find out that I completely missed checking the temperature pressure relief valve on all the water heaters, well, that I only discovered that at the end of the process, and the process has ended. That means in order for me to check that one thing, which could have been done a part of the process, had I been worried about the process more than I was just putting a check mark in a completion item, I might have picked that up halfway through, or maybe even at the beginning. Unfortunately, I was so focused on the end, the lagging indicator. That realization only came about because, in my mind, you may have figured that out before, but to me, thinking of the goal as a lagging indicator, that I'm still figuring out application for that as a concept. You see, I want to have these conversations with these people. And it goes into some people that I might meet or be able to ask in person. So, like, for instance, Bill Nye, one of the hosts on the Multifamily Media Network, has this book, Culture Grows, and I'm reading it as well. Yes, I read more than one. Yes, I'm a nerd. Audible and audiobooks are perfectly acceptable. The only problem is I have a hard time highlighting and underlining and circling in those. Although, yes, there is a bookmark feature on most audiobook podcasts, so it's not outside of the realm. But in this case, I know for a fact I will be in a couple of places later on this year that Bill Nye is. And in addition to wanting to support him, he's a really brilliant guy, and he's got some great things to say. In this book, he had this profound point that actually, if you're listening to the Turnover as a podcast that Mark Sharp and Chris Karamonica and I are having these kind of unspecified conversations. On the first one, I actually talk about this concept, and that was recorded before I had a copy of his book. But I hadn't thought of it in this light. He says in here, culture is not only what is expected, but it is also what will and will not be tolerated. If you've listened to the Turnover, I talk in that conversation that we're having about understanding what situation normal is. And Bill, in that context of that chapter, is talking about that culture is not only what you set out to do, but it's how you approach. And the more that I think through that statement and interaction and this conversation that I'm having with Bill Nye, even though we're not together, he reinforces what James Clear in his book said. If culture is your goal, then the process is what needs to be focused on, because the process, that's what you do and don't tolerate. These are conversations that I have that help to form my thinking. I would actually encourage you to begin having these conversations with whatever form of medium that you're having. I was listening, I guess it was about 3 weeks ago now, to a conversation between two extremely smart people, and they were having a disagreement. It was respectful, but it was a disagreement. They both saw opposite sides, and they both had valid arguments, but I found myself agreeing with one of them more than the other one. And I got to the point to where I actually paused the video. It happened to be on the YouTubes. And I paused the video as I'm, in this case, I was actually driving down the road. I hit the pause button on my phone, and I had roughly a 20-mile conversation with that video about what I wanted the host, the speaker that I agreed with, to say to the person that I disagreed with. And then, just for fun, I decided to have a conversation back with myself on my opposing viewpoint. Yes, it is acceptable to disagree with not only yourself, but it's acceptable, even constructive, to disagree with, respectfully, a book, data, specifics. Not to the point of complete no, throw it away, get away. But when you're reading a book, if you have an opposing viewpoint, disagree. Remember, it's a conversation. That means there's a back and forth. If you happen to disagree with something, I haven't found anything that I disagree with Bill Nye about. And honestly, having seen Bill talk for a while and attend a few of his presentations and hear him discuss things. I doubt I would disagree with him on much. If there was, I would do it and talk through both forming what my opinion is, what my thoughts are, and at the same time, try and think through based on the context of what all I know about Mr. Nye and what I would think. If I have questions, I'm going to write a question mark right next to whatever's in his book in hopes that the book answers my question. In the same way that if I have a question about any other book that I read. Now, by this point in our conversation that we're having today, we're roughly 20 minutes or so into this particular episode, and you might be beginning to wonder of, okay, Paul, I don't like reading that much. I'm not really listening to other people speak and thinking through. So what's in this for me? I'll tell you what's in this for you. The same way that I go through books, making notes, interacting with them, is a way of looking at data. I'm currently doing some research for a presentation that I'm going to give a couple of times this year. And it's about residents and work orders and customer service for residents on site, looking at it through a different lens and come up with ways of how it applies. Now, data that I'm specifically looking at is work orders and maintenance service and maintenance technician over a course of a time period. And chances are you have access to that data, that information. And what I'm suggesting you to do is have a conversation with whatever report or spreadsheet or narrative or interactive or even the app that you are using. Have a conversation, ask it questions. Maybe you don't write in the margins like what I do, but make notes. If you're looking at it on a computer and you just happen to be going in Excel, put a comment. If you're dealing with a lot of online services, like, there's too many of them to count in all the various platforms. My guess is there's a way to either bookmark or comment or note or memo or whatever their process is. My encouragement to you is instead of just reading it, interact with it. Do what Dr. Peterson said. Close it after you're done, and then write down what you remember from what you were just looking at. I recommend interaction in the same way that our time here is spent. Thank you for joining me in this conversation today. I do appreciate your time and your attention. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week and be well. I'll see you somewhere. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Maintenance Mindset. I hope you take away ideas that apply to your current and future career goals. Please check out Maintenance Mindset Minute to hear short-form, high-impact, applicable, maintenance-centered information. Whatever you do today, do it with a maintenance mindset. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, comment, and subscribe. Visit multifamilymedianetwork.com to learn more about our other industry podcasts, thought pieces, and sponsorship opportunities. I'll see you somewhere.